The year is 1348, and death is sailing across the English Channel. In the holds of merchant ships, nestled among bales of wool and casks of wine, an invisible killer makes its journey toward one of Europe's most vibrant cities.
London, with its 100,000 souls packed into narrow streets and timber-framed houses, has no idea that it stands on the threshold of 3 centuries of horror.
Before we delve into this remarkable and terrifying story, if you're fascinated by untold historical tales like this one, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We'll be bringing you more incredible stories from the past that shaped our world. The story of London's plague is not simply the tale of a disease. It is the story of how a city, a people, and an entire civilization learned to live with death as a constant companion.
For nearly 300 years, the plague would return to London again and again, each time rewriting the rules of life, death, commerce, and human connection. This is the story of humanity's longest battle against an invisible enemy, fought in the streets, churches, and homes of one of the world's greatest cities. Each outbreak would test London's resolve, and each recovery would make the city stronger and more resilient than before. In the autumn of 1348, the first cases began to appear in the port districts along the Thames. Sailors stumbled off ships with fever and agonizing swellings in their necks and armpits. Within days, they were dead. Within weeks, the disease had spread like wildfire through London's densely packed neighborhoods. The people called it the Great Mortality, though history would remember it by another name, the Black Death. Picture London in 1348. The city is a maze of narrow, winding streets, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Wooden houses lean so close together that neighbors can shake hands from their upper windows. The Thames runs brown and sluggish, choked with the waste of 100,000 people. Pigs and dogs roam freely through the streets, competing with rats for scraps of refuse. The air is thick with the smoke of countless fires and the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food and human waste. Into this medieval world, where life is already precarious and death a familiar visitor, comes a killer unlike anything the city has ever known. The plague arrives with a merchant named John de Stratford, though his name would be lost to history were it not recorded in the chronicles of a Westminster monk. Stratford's ship docks at Billingsgate on a gray October morning, carrying not just goods from Flanders, but also the fleas that carry the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Within 3 days of the ship's arrival, dock workers begin falling ill. They complain of fever, then develop painful, egg-sized swellings called buboes in their necks, armpits, and groins. Their skin turns black with hemorrhages. Most are dead within a week. The disease spreads with terrifying speed through London's crowded parishes. In Cheapside, the city's main commercial district, entire families disappear within days. The wealthy try to flee, but many carry the disease with them to their country estates. The poor, trapped in the city's slums, die by the thousands. Contemporary chroniclers struggle to comprehend the scale of death. Henry Knighton writes that scarcely 1 in 10 survived. The usually meticulous church records become chaotic, then stop altogether as the clerks themselves succumb to the plague they're trying to document. By Christmas of 1348, London is a city transformed by death. Entire streets stand empty, their doors marked with red crosses. The normal rhythms of commerce have ground to a halt. The great markets that once teemed with merchants and customers now echo with the cries of the dying. Church bells, which once marked the hours with their measured tolling, now ring constantly for the dead, until the Bishop of London orders them to stop, not from compassion, but because the sound drives the living to despair. The social fabric of medieval London begins to unravel. Servants abandon their masters, children flee their parents, and priests refuse to give last rites to plague victims. The city's carefully maintained hierarchy collapses as death makes equals of nobleman and beggar alike. In the words of one survivor, the living were scarcely sufficient to bury the dead. Mass graves are dug outside the city walls, and bodies are carted away like refuse. Yet even in this darkest hour, London's essential character asserts itself. The city's merchants, those who survive, quickly adapt to new realities. Prices for basic goods skyrocket, But so do wages for the suddenly scarce workers. Women take over businesses from their dead husbands, and apprentices become masters overnight. The plague, for all its horror, becomes an engine of social transformation, accelerating changes that might have taken generations under normal circumstances. By the spring of 1349, the worst seems to be over. The death toll begins to slow, and survivors emerge blinking into a changed world. London has lost perhaps 40% of its population, 40,000 souls in less than a year. But the city endures, and its people begin the long process of rebuilding their lives. They do not yet know that this is only the beginning of a pattern that will define London for the next 3 centuries. The plague returns to London in 1361, just as a new generation has grown up with no memory of the first outbreak. This second visitation strikes particularly hard at children and young adults, earning it the grim nickname, the mortality of children. Then it comes again in 1369 and again in 1375. The pattern is established. Every few years, sometimes every decade, the plague returns to claim its tribute from London's growing population. Each outbreak brings its own character and its own horrors. The plague of 1563 strikes during the height of summer, when the city swelters in unprecedented heat. Bodies decompose so quickly that they must be buried within hours of death. The outbreak of 1593 coincides with harvest failures, creating a perfect storm of disease and famine. In 1603, the year of James I's coronation, the plague kills 30,000 Londoners, forcing the new king to cancel his public celebrations. Through it all, London adapts and develops an elaborate system of plague regulations that becomes a model for Europe. Houses of plague victims are sealed with red crosses and the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," painted on their doors. The inhabitants are locked inside for 40 days, a quarantine period based on biblical precedent rather than medical knowledge, but remarkably close to the actual incubation period of the disease. Watchmen are posted to ensure no one enters or leaves these houses of death. The city establishes pest houses, crude hospitals, where the poor are sent to die or recover away from the general population. The mortality bills, weekly tallies of deaths by parish and cause, become the world's first systematic attempt to track epidemic disease. Every Thursday, these bills are posted throughout the city, allowing residents to gauge their chances of survival and make decisions about whether to stay or flee. London's doctors, trained in the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, struggle to understand what they're facing. They blame the plague on miasma, bad air caused by the alignment of planets or the rotting of organic matter. Their treatments reflect this misunderstanding. They recommend fleeing to higher ground, burning aromatic woods to purify the air, and bloodletting to balance the body's humors. Some physicians refuse to treat plague patients at all, while others become wealthy selling useless remedies to desperate families. The common people develop their own theories and treatments. Some believe the plague is God's punishment for sin and respond with extreme piety, or, conversely, with wild abandonment to pleasure while they still live. Others blame minority groups, particularly Jews and foreigners, and violence erupts in the city streets. Superstitions flourish, carrying certain herbs, wearing amulets, or reciting specific prayers are all believed to ward off infection. Yet gradually, through bitter experience, Londoners learn practical measures that actually help. They notice that the plague seems to follow trade routes and spreads fastest in crowded areas. Wealthy families begin retreating to country houses at the first sign of an outbreak. The city government starts regulating the movements of people and goods during plague seasons. Street cleaning becomes more systematic, though the reasons are not yet understood. The economic impact of recurring plague transforms London from a medieval city into something recognizably modern. The constant threat of death makes people more willing to take risks, spurring innovation and entrepreneurship. The repeated loss of population creates labor shortages that drive up wages and break down the rigid class structures of medieval society. Women gain unprecedented economic power as they inherit businesses from their plague-dead husbands and fathers. London's position as England's commercial heart ensures that plague becomes an international concern. Other European cities watch London's responses carefully, adopting successful strategies and learning from failures. The bills of mortality become templates for public health monitoring across Europe. London's plague regulations influenced the development of quarantine systems from Amsterdam to Venice. The cultural impact is equally profound. Plague transforms English literature, giving birth to the memento mori tradition and influencing writers from Chaucer to Shakespeare. The theater companies that will produce Hamlet and King Lear learn to pack up and leave London at the first sign of plague, taking their plays to the provinces. Churches commission elaborate monuments to plague victims, while artists develop new symbolic languages to represent death and resurrection. Children growing up in plague-time London develop a fundamentally different relationship with mortality than their ancestors. Death is not a distant prospect to be considered in old age, but an immediate possibility that might strike at any moment. This awareness influences everything from family structures to religious practices to economic planning. London becomes a city of orphans and widows, of interrupted apprenticeships and broken family lines. By the early 17th century, plague has become so embedded in London's social fabric that the city cannot imagine existing without it. The infrastructure built to cope with recurring outbreaks, the pest houses, the system of parish watchmen, the procedures for sealing infected houses becomes permanent features of urban life. Entire industries develop around plague management: coffin makers, grave diggers, street cleaners, and herb sellers who supply protective amulets and medicines. The winter of 1664 seems like any other in London's plague-haunted history. The city has endured another outbreak the previous year, losing perhaps 10,000 souls, and the survivors are rebuilding their lives with practiced efficiency. No one realizes that they stand on the threshold of the most devastating plague outbreak in London's history. An epidemic so terrible that it will finally break the pattern of recurring pestilence and earn the name by which it is still remembered: the Great Plague of London. The first cases appear in the spring of 1665 in the overcrowded parishes outside the city walls. These areas, home to London's poorest residents, have always been the plague's first targets. But this time is different. The disease spreads with unprecedented ferocity, jumping from house to house, parish to parish, with terrifying speed. By summer, the weekly mortality bills record thousands of deaths, far exceeding any previous outbreak. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, captures the growing horror in his daily entries. In June, he notes seeing his first plague house marked with a red cross. By July, he writes of streets so empty that grass grows between the cobblestones. In August, he describes the nightly ritual of death carts rolling through London's streets, their drivers calling, "Bring out your dead." The very rhythm of urban life changes as the living adjust to the proximity of mass death. King Charles II and his court flee London in July, abandoning the city to its fate. Parliament follows, relocating to Oxford. The wealthy merchant families pack their belongings and retreat to country estates. But the vast majority of Londoners have nowhere to go. They remain in the increasingly empty city, living in a strange twilight world where normal social conventions have collapsed under the weight of mortality. Daniel Defoe, though only a child during the Great Plague, will later write the most famous account of these terrible months. His Journal of the Plague Year, published decades later, captures the atmosphere of a city under siege by an invisible enemy. He describes streets littered with the bodies of those who died trying to escape their sealed houses, families discovered weeks after they perished together, and the strange silence that settles over neighborhoods where every house bears the mark of death. The city government, depleted by death and desertion, struggles to maintain basic services. The Lord Mayor, Sir John Lawrence, becomes a heroic figure by remaining at his post when others flee. He organizes the distribution of food to sealed houses, ensures the continued removal of bodies, and tries to maintain some semblance of order in a city descending into chaos. His daily rides through empty streets become legendary, symbols of civic duty in the face of catastrophe. The plague's impact extends far beyond mere numbers of dead. London's economy collapses as trade grinds to a halt. Other English cities refuse to accept goods from the infected capital. Ships avoid London's ports, taking their cargoes to Bristol or Portsmouth instead. The Royal Exchange, heart of England's commercial empire, stands empty except for the echoing footsteps of guards and the occasional desperate merchant. Religious life transforms as well. Many clergy flee their parishes, leaving the dying without spiritual comfort. Others, like the heroic rector of St. Giles Cripplegate, remain to comfort the afflicted until they themselves succumb. Church services become impossible as congregations dwindle, and buildings are commandeered as temporary mortuaries. Some turn to extreme piety, seeing the plague as divine punishment requiring repentance. Others abandon faith entirely, concluding that no benevolent God could permit such suffering. Yet even in this darkest hour, human courage and compassion shine through. Physicians like Nathaniel Hodges remain in the city to treat patients, knowing they likely face death themselves. Volunteer nurses care for the sick in the pest houses. Neighbors risk infection to bring food to sealed houses. The city's bakers continue baking bread even as their fellow guild members die around them, ensuring that survivors have something to eat. By autumn, the weekly death toll reaches staggering heights. The bills of mortality record over 7,000 deaths in a single week in September. Though the true number is certainly higher, as many bodies are never officially counted, entire parishes are virtually depopulated. The great livery companies that governed London's trades lose most of their members. Ancient family businesses simply disappear as owners and employees alike succumb. The physical landscape of London bears witness to the catastrophe. Mass burial pits are dug in fields outside the city walls. The plague pit in Aldgate becomes so full that bodies must be covered with only inches of dirt. Houses stand empty with doors and windows nailed shut, their interiors becoming tombs for entire families. Grass and weeds begin to grow in the normally busy streets, giving London the appearance of a city abandoned to nature. As winter approaches, the death toll finally begins to decline. The cold weather slows the spread of fleas that carry the plague bacteria, though this connection will not be understood for centuries. By Christmas of 1665, the worst seems to be over. Survivors emerge from their hiding places to survey the devastation. London has lost perhaps 100,000 residents, nearly a quarter of its population. Entire neighborhoods stand empty, their silence broken only by the wind through broken windows. The spring of 1666 brings both hope and continued fear. The plague continues to claim victims, though in smaller numbers. Londoners begin the slow process of rebuilding their shattered city. Refugees start returning from the countryside, often to find their homes and businesses destroyed or occupied by others. The courts are clogged with disputes over property and inheritance, as families try to sort out the chaos left by mass death. Trade slowly resumes as other cities cautiously reopen their markets to London goods. Ships begin returning to Thameside docks. The Royal Exchange reopens with elaborate ceremonies designed to signal that London is ready to reclaim its position as England's commercial capital. But the city that emerges from the plague is fundamentally changed. Old social hierarchies have been shattered, traditional trades disrupted, and the very meaning of community transformed by the shared trauma of survival. Then, on September 2nd, 1666, as London struggles to recover from the plague, disaster strikes from a new quarter. A fire breaks out in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of the morning. In the dry conditions following a long summer, and with so many houses standing empty and unmaintained after the plague, the fire spreads with devastating speed. Within days, it has consumed most of the medieval city of London, destroying 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless businesses. The Great Fire of London proves to be a strange blessing in disguise. The flames consume the narrow, overcrowded medieval streets where plague had thrived for centuries. They destroy the timber houses with their overhanging upper stories, the dark cellars and hidden corners where rats had nested, and the accumulated filth of generations. The fire also destroys the psychological hold that plague had maintained over London for 3 centuries. The old city, with its memories of death and suffering embedded in every street corner, is literally burned away. When Sir Christopher Wren begins rebuilding London, he creates a city of wider streets, brick houses, and better sanitation, a city where plague will struggle to gain its old foothold. The new London that rises from the ashes is built not just with better materials and planning, but with a new confidence that human ingenuity can triumph over natural disaster. As the decades pass after 1666, plague continues to visit London occasionally, but never again with the devastating force of previous centuries. The last major outbreak occurs in 1679, claiming about 3,000 lives, a significant number, but nothing compared to the 100,000 lost in 1665. By 1700, plague has essentially disappeared from London, though the city doesn't yet understand why. The reasons become clear only with the development of modern medical knowledge. Plague is primarily a disease of rats, spread by fleas that jump to human hosts when their rodent victims die. The rebuilding of London after 1666 creates conditions less favorable to rat populations. Stone and brick construction provides fewer nesting places than the old timber buildings. Wider streets allow better air circulation, and improved sanitation reduces the food sources that support large rodent colonies. Changes in global trade patterns also play a role. London's ships increasingly trade with the Americas and India rather than the plague-infested ports of the eastern Mediterranean where the disease had originated. The brown rat, which carries different fleas less likely to bite humans, begins displacing the black rat that had been plague's primary host. These ecological changes, invisible to 18th century Londoners, gradually break the chain of infection that had terrorized the city for centuries. The victory over plague transforms London into the confident, expanding metropolis of the Georgian era. Without the constant threat of epidemic disease, the city can plan for the future with unprecedented confidence. Population grows steadily, trade expands, and London begins its transformation into the capital of a global empire. The resources once devoted to managing plague, the pest houses, quarantine systems, and emergency protocols are gradually dismantled or repurposed. But the memory of plague leaves permanent marks on London's culture and character. The experience of living with constant mortality creates a distinctly English attitude toward death, stoic, practical, and tinged with dark humor. The literary tradition established during plague centuries continues to influence writers from Johnson to Dickens. The scientific approach to disease monitoring pioneered in London's Bills of Mortality evolves into modern epidemiology. London's victory over plague also provides lessons that prove invaluable to future generations facing epidemic diseases. The quarantine systems developed during plague centuries become models for dealing with cholera in the 19th century and influenza in the 20th. The principle of systematic disease surveillance, first established with the Bills of Mortality, underlies modern public health practice. The recognition that poverty and overcrowding facilitate disease spread influences urban planning for centuries. The great hospitals that define modern London, St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, Guy's, all have their origins in institutions established to care for plague victims. The medical profession itself is shaped by centuries of plague experience, developing traditions of service and sacrifice that continue to define healthcare. The very idea that society has a collective responsibility to protect public health grows out of London's long struggle against epidemic disease. Perhaps most importantly, London's plague centuries demonstrate the remarkable resilience of human communities in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Time and again, the city faces devastation that should, by all logic, have destroyed it permanently. Yet each time, survivors pick up the pieces and rebuild, often creating something stronger than what came before. The London that emerges from 3 centuries of plague is not just a city that has survived. It is a city transformed by survival into something unprecedented in human history. The final plague death in London occurs sometime in the early years of the 18th century. An anonymous victim, whose passing marks the end of one of history's longest battles between humanity and disease. By then, few Londoners remember the terror of the great outbreaks. The city has moved on to new challenges and opportunities, its confidence restored by victory over its oldest enemy. Yet the story of London's plague centuries remains profoundly relevant to our modern world. As we face new infectious diseases and global pandemics, we can learn much from London's long experience. The city's ultimate triumph came not through a single breakthrough or heroic gesture, but through the gradual accumulation of practical knowledge, institutional adaptation, and community resilience. London survived not because its people were braver or smarter than others, but because they learned to adapt, to experiment, and to never give up hope. The narrow streets where plague once stalked its victims have given way to broad avenues and modern buildings. The Thames runs cleaner now, its banks lined with monuments to human achievement rather than mass graves. But beneath the surface of contemporary London, the bones of plague victims still rest in forgotten burial grounds, silent witnesses to one of humanity's greatest struggles. Their legacy is not one of despair, but of triumph. The triumph of a city that refused to surrender to fear, that learned from each disaster, and that ultimately transformed catastrophe into opportunity. In understanding London's plague history, we gain more than mere knowledge of the past. We discover timeless truths about human nature, urban resilience, and the complex relationship between disease and civilization. London's victory over plague reminds us that even the most daunting challenges can be overcome through persistence, adaptation, and the fundamental human refusal to accept defeat. As we face the health challenges of our own era, we carry with us the hard-won wisdom of those who fought and won history's longest war against disease. If this journey through London's plague-haunted centuries has intrigued you, I encourage you to explore more of our historical documentaries by subscribing to our channel. History has so many remarkable stories to tell, and understanding our past helps us navigate the challenges of today. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's most fascinating and tragic chapters. Until next time, remember that even in our darkest hours, human resilience and ingenuity can light the way forward.